Hello. I wish you doing well. It is a war that most major and minor powers in Europe took part in after the succession of Maria Theresa to the Habsburg dynasty. The war also witnessed a number of minor events, such as the King George War in British America, the Fractured Years' War, which officially began on October 23, 1739, the Carnatic First War in India, the Jacobin Uprising in 1745 in Scotland, and the First and Second Silesian Wars. During the 16th and 17th centuries, European kingdoms had found a great treasure for them, the two American continents and their New World. The conflict intensified with the attempts of each of these kingdoms to build settlements and colonize all that could be controlled from the New World, so the 2 centuries carried many wars between the European empires. Some of them are very large and others are not important and are usually overlooked, and this war is one of the second type. This war took place between the English and the Spanish between 1739 and 1743, and although it was limited to some fruitless sea confrontations for either side, and did not include any real events, what is interesting is the reason that was used as an excuse to start it originally, as it was argued that the Spanish had cut off the ear of the famous English smuggler, and, if this reason seems strange to a war, it becomes stranger when you know that the smuggling of the ears of the smuggler was more than 8 years before the war began. The story comes from an agreement between the English and Spanish at the time, which allowed English ships to trade goods up to 500 tons each year within the Caribbean islands under Spanish rule, and it also gives the British the right to sell slaves indefinitely there, and in return, the Spanish have the right to inspect incoming English ships to make sure there were no cases of smuggling, so when the Spanish arrested the smugglers, they tortured and killed them. These actions were not really important, as they were very expected. But for some reason the case of the English smuggler, Robert Jenkins, was different, as he was caught running away in 1731, and as a result he was struck by a sword that killed his ear. The matter subsided completely when it happened and no one took care of him until 8 years later, when the story, Jenkins and his severed ear, was exploited to garner popular support for a war on Spain, and somehow the Jenkins ear succeeded in achieving what was needed. The reason for the outbreak of the war was that Maria Theresa was considered ineligible to rule the lands she inherited from her father, Emperor Charles V, because Saudi law deprived women of a royal inheritance. This was the primary pretext that France and Prussia, and later Bavaria, invoked against the Habsburgs and their authority. Maria Theresa has received support from Britain, the Netherlands, Sardinia and Saxony. Since 1739, Spain has fought its separate wars with Britain, known as the Fractured Ear War, and took place in the Americas. But she also became involved in the European War, hoping to restore her former possessions in northern Italy, which then came under the authority of Austria. Considering that Spain had previously restored the Kingdom of Naples in 1735, entering into that war would enable it to regain the lands it lost according to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The war ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, while Maria Theresa gained official recognition as the Archduke of Austria and the Queen of Hungary. But Prussia kept Silesia. When buried problems are solved, in addition to the political turmoil in Europe, these factors led to the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763. The direct cause of the outbreak of the War of the Austrian Caliphate was the death of Emperor Charles V, 1685–1740, and the legacy of the Habsburg royal family, generally referred to as Austria. In 1703, the mutual succession pact between Emperor Leopold I and his 2 sons Joseph and Charles led to an agreement to divide the property of the Habsburgs. If there was no male heir left, the property goes first to the female heirs of the descendants of Joseph, then the female heirs of the descendants of Charles. Because valid law deprived women of their inheritance, approval must be obtained from the imperial parliament and the territories of the Habsburgs. Joseph died in 1711 after leaving 2 daughters, Maria Joseph and Maria Amalia, and Charles became the last mention of the Habsburg dynasty. In April 1713, Charles issued the practical decree, allowing women to obtain the heirs, but he placed his daughters, who were not yet born, before the daughters of Joseph on the list of heirs. Maria Theresa was born in 1717, thus ensuring her succession to her father's throne. In 1719, Charles asked his 2 nieces, Maria Joseph and Maria Amalia, to waive their rights to Maria Theresa in exchange for their marriage to Frederick August, the Prince of Saxony, and Charles Albert, the Prince of Bavaria, respectively. Charles hoped that those marriages would guarantee the position of his daughter. No one would accept Saxony or Bavaria, one of whom would take control of the Habsburg family's estate, but Charles's actions undermined the logic of that agreement. This family issue has become a European contention due to political tensions within the Holy Roman Empire, caused by the dramatic expansion of the power and size of Bavaria, Prussia, and Saxony, which was reflected in the period following the Habsburgs' expansion in the territories that were formerly dependent on the Ottoman Empire. Other complications arose from the position of the Holy Roman Emperor, which has been occupied by the Habsburgs since 1437. These were the central reasons behind the War of the Caliphate, which reshaped the traditional balance of European powers, so most of the legal demands were merely allegations of the occupation of more territory. Bavaria and Saxony refused to comply with the decisions of the Imperial Parliament, while France agreed in 1738 to support the legitimate demands of Charles Albert, Prince of Bavaria, despite the acceptance of practical sanctions previously in 1735. The war can be divided into three independent but related conflicts. The First War broke out to impose control of Silesia between Prussia and Austria. In the Second War, France tried to weaken Austria's power in Germany, while Spain sought to recover the lands it lost in Italy after the War of the Spanish Succession. As for the Third War, it was between Britain and France in an accelerating global race to show supremacy, and in the end, France was able to invade and occupy the Austrian lowlands, which ultimately gained its absolute control, while Britain's maritime victories achieved increasing dominance over water. Throughout most of the 18th century, France fought wars in the same manner, either to let the colonies defend themselves, or to provide minimum levels of aid. It was sending a limited number of untrained forces or soldiers, and France considered the colonial battles to be losers anyway. But France was, to some extent, forced to pursue that strategy. The geographical reasons and the superiority of the British Navy made it difficult to provide aid and support to the French colonies. In addition, similarly, the long land borders required the establishment of a strong local army. According to these military necessities, the French government focused its war strategy on the French army in Europe. It kept most of its forces on the European continent, hoping that that great military force would bring victory in the battles near France. After the end of the Austrian Caliphate War, France returned all the property it had occupied in Europe. But it acquired some overseas property such as Louisbourg, that is, restored to its pre-war status. The British, on the other hand, tried, according to Britain's tendency at that time and for practical reasons, to avoid sending large forces from armies to the European continent. The British sought to redress the imbalance of powers emerging in Europe by forging alliances with one or more major countries, especially countries whose interests conflicted with those of Britain's enemies, particularly France. In the War of the Austrian Caliphate, the British allied with Austria, but by the 7 Years' War they allied themselves with Prussia, Austria's enemy. Unlike France, Britain struggled to keep fights in the colonies when it was involved in a war, thereby fully exploiting its naval power. The British pursued a dual strategy of applying a naval blockade, bombing enemy ports, and exploiting Britain's naval ability to transport soldiers by sea. Britain was attacking enemy ships and attacking the forward positions of it, using the residents of the colonies adjacent to its colonies to do so. That plan worked better in North America than in Europe, but laid the foundations for the 7 Years' War. When Frederick became 28 years old, he succeeded his father, Frederick William, in the position of King of Prussia, on the 31st of the month of May 1740. The importance of Prussia increased in the previous decades, but its borders and scattered lands prevented it from possessing a prominent authority and power in Europe, and this what Frederick tried to change. The death of Emperor Charles VI came on the 20th of October 1740 and constituted an opportunity to annex Silesia to Prussia, but Frederick had to rush to the annexation of Silesia before Augustus, Prince of Saxony and later King of Poland, preceded it. Thanks to Frederick William and Leopold Prince of Anhalt-Dessau, the Prussian army was one of the best soldiers in Europe in terms of training and command. The Prussian army avoided the battles that took place recently during that period, which made it an unknown factor in the war, and its number reached 80,000 fighters, which is an equally large number. The armed forces did not constitute only 4% of the population of 2.2 million. While Austria had a population of 16 million, and its armed forces numbered 157,000, the financial restrictions that Austria suffered made that number significantly less. Since the expanse of Austria was so wide, the army had to defend large swaths of territory and was unable to protect the country from invading enemy forces. In addition to these qualitative advantages that Prussia possessed, Frederick worked to launch two war fronts by signing a secret treaty with France in April 1739, in which it was agreed that France would attack Austria from the west, while Prussia would be attacked from the east. In early December 1740, the Prussian army gathered along the Oder, and on December 16th, they invaded Silesia without an official declaration of war. Wish you enjoy here. Thanks for watching. Goodbye, my friends.